Now, the rest of the story. After only 23 years, Frank Winfield's life was over. Too frail for farm work, he had taken a clerk's job in a dry goods store in Watertown, New York. It's what he had always wanted to be, even as a child, a clerk in a dry goods store. And yet the young man who had been too soft for the family farm found himself continually derided by employers and co-workers and clientele as too much of a farm boy for the big city. Moreover, the duties of his job, at least in terms of what they took out of him, were comparable to the kind he'd left behind. So, young Frank's apprenticeship at the corner store on Public Square had been insufferable from the start. And it only got worse. 14 hours a day he washed windows and swept floors, delivered packages and polished cuspidors. All of this in between humiliating encounters with customers who were much amused by the rube the store had hired. After 3 years of all work and no play, Frank, exhausted, resigned, became salesman at Bushnell's, a nearby competitor of the corner store. A little less stress, he had thought. He'd thought wrong. Now, in addition to selling merchandise all day, Frank soon found himself doubling as the store's watchdog, sleeping on an iron cot in the basement with a pistol under his pillow. And that might have been all right, except that one morning, Mr. Bushnell took Frank aside and complained that the young man was a lousy salesman, and then told him that his salary would be reduced from $10 a week to $8. The added burden of this new discouragement was more than Frank could bear. Shortly thereafter, he collapsed. A doctor was summoned. Complete rest was prescribed. So Frank, now 23, returned home, was put to bed, where he remained an invalid. But this is the rest of the story. Frank's mother, unable to keep up with farm chores and look after her son at the same time, hired a young woman from town to do the latter. Her name was Jenny Crichton. Jenny was a seamstress by trade, but having grown up with 8 brothers and sisters, she had done her share of nursing, and so, enthusiastically, tenderly, patiently, and compassionately, young Jenny took vigil at Frank's bedside, feeding him when he was too weak to feed himself, encouraging him with confident words, smiling blue eyes, and over the months that followed, the young man in her care grew well again and stronger than ever, and, oh yes, the two fell in love. Frank Winfield and Jenny Crichton were married in the farmhouse parlor June 11, 1876. And something else. Through Jenny's faith in her new husband discovered faith in himself, and thus armed, he returned to the dry goods battleground, to the corner store in Watertown, and emerged triumphant, as have few in the annals of retail warfare. Over the generations since, we have forgotten the New York farm boy who wanted to be a store clerk, as well as the store clerk who wanted to come home. But now, whenever you pass his century-old establishment, you'll remember Jenny, the girl who transformed a mouse into a miracle man named Frank Winfield, F.W. Woolworth, because now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. Frank Winfield Woolworth had a brilliant mind for business, despite what his early employers believed. Frank originally wanted to become a peddler or a door-to-door salesman. As a child, he and his brother Charles played store, as most children do, but Frank played it as if he could see his own destiny. One of Frank's first jobs was in Augsbury and Moore's dry goods store in Watertown, New York. By all accounts, Frank was not a good salesman, so he was relegated to menial tasks such as sweeping floors, washing windows, and even arranging the store's window display. But Frank had a knack for displays. Frank's front window displays were so impressive that his boss put him in charge of the displays. Rather than being just another disgruntled employee, Frank paid attention to details. While working at those menial tasks, he studied the interactions between the salesmen and customers. He overheard conversations between wholesalers and retail purchasers. He noted what people liked and disliked about their shopping experiences. Frank studied the whole process of retail sales and began to notice that there were problems with how retail stores operated. At the time, retail stores throughout the world followed the same basic formula. Manufacturers sold their goods to wholesalers, commonly referred to as the middleman. Wholesalers marked the goods up and sold the goods to the retailers. Retail clerks and consumers then haggled over the final prices on the showroom floor because items were rarely labeled with prices. Goods were normally kept out of reach of the customers and had to be retrieved by clerks during a transaction. This type of business model sounds foreign to us today, largely because of Frank Woolworth. Almost all modern retailers use his basic retail formula. Now, whether Frank invented the concept of the five and dime stores or whether he was just an early adopter of that business model has been debated for well over 100 years. In February of 1879, Frank opened Woolworth's great 5-cent store in Utica, New York. All items cost a nickel, kind of like the Dollar Tree. Business was slow and his store failed within weeks. Frank reevaluated his business model and tried again in April of the same year when he opened another store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This time, in addition to items which cost a nickel, Frank expanded his inventory to items which cost a dime. This was the origin of the 5 and dime store, sometimes called 5 and 10 cent stores or simply dime stores. Rather than haggling over prices, Frank had each item priced at either 5 cents or 10 cents. His store thrived. Within 10 years, Frank had purchased 10 more stores, which thrived as well. By 1900, Frank owned 59 stores, which generated over $5 million, which, adjusted for inflation, amounts to about $183 million in today's money. That was just the beginning. Frank began buying up his competitors' struggling stores and converting them to his 5 and 10 cent store business model. With a large number of stores, he was able to purchase a larger volume of inventory and at a lower price. He disliked the idea of buying from a wholesaler, the middleman, so he made deals directly with manufacturers. This allowed him to buy items at even a lower price. All items in his store had fixed selling prices to eliminate haggling. Rather than having merchandise out of reach of customers, his stores were the first to use self-service display cases where the customers could examine and touch the inventory without the help of a sales clerk. This meant that he could have a smaller staff of clerks, which meant that he could sell items at even lower prices. Walmart immediately comes to mind when I think of his business model. By 1911, Frank's company owned 586 stores. 2 years later, Frank built the 792-foot Woolworth building in New York City, the tallest building in the world at the time, at a cost of $13.5 million, which would be about $437 million in today's money. And Frank paid for the building's construction in cash. Wow! The Woolworth building was nicknamed the Cathedral of Commerce. It was built with 24 high-speed elevators in its lobby. In 1913, 2 of those elevators traveled at 700 feet per minute and were reportedly the fastest elevators in the world. When Frank died on April 8, 1919, he was one of the richest people in the world. During the early and middle of the 20th century, it looked as though Woolworth stores were impervious to competition. It had just grown so large. However, other retailers adopted his business model and grew quickly. Beginning in the 1980s, Woolworth's grip on the retail market began to decline. Only its sporting goods division continued to grow. In July of 1997, the company decided to focus solely on sporting goods, and Woolworth's, that chain of stores that Frank built, went out of business. The company was renamed Venator Group. 4 years later, the company changed its name again, this time to one that's more familiar to us. Woolworths evolved into the sportswear and footwear retailers called Foot Locker. Now, can you imagine how our shopping experiences would be today Had Frank Woolworth listened to what his co-workers and bosses told him early on? That he was no good at retail sales? That he was in the wrong line of work altogether? If Frank had given up all those years ago, we may have to haggle over every loaf of bread, every gallon of milk, every single thing we buy. Now, what would that be like in our digital shopping age? Now, if you see a way to change the world for the better, never give up. Do it. You may fail at first, just as Frank did, but keep trying. Someone said, we learn more from our mistakes than from our successes. It was certainly true in Frank's case, and I think it's true in all of us. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And as Paul Harvey would say, good day.